Good evening, good morning, good night, good second breakfast, wherever you are, wherever you are. My name is Laura González, and I welcome you to Lunatic Mondays on CSNP, the Circle Sanctuary Network podcast. And today I have a guest that I am dying to pick her brain and learn everything that she has learned so far. Her name is Alice Markham-Cantor, and she is a writer and fact checker from Brooklyn, New York. Her reported work has appeared in New York Magazine, Scientific American, The Nation, and elsewhere. She serves on the working committee for the International Network Against Accusations of Witchcraft and Associated Harmful Practices. And this is her first book called The Once and Future Witch Hunt, A Descendant's Reckoning from Salem to the Present. Just the cover is mesmerizer. Just the cover, and um, I'm fascinated. I'm very happy and very honored to have you on the show tonight. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me here today, Laura. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for coming. And part of the book, kind of like part of the beginning of the book, the introduction actually speaks about this phrase that is so trite and a lot of people repeat a lot, that we are the granddaughters of the witches that you couldn't burn. And I can see by your facial expression already how much you love that phrase.
Uh, uh,
Um, and the case of the matter, what I tell people is when I hear people repeat that on the pagan community, the witchcraft community, and the Wiccan community, is what we know so far, the regular people, not a person like you. But what we know is that these were probably very likely people of faith, God-fearing women, and they were probably Christians. So we do not do a favor to call them the witches that you couldn't burn. It is it is horrible. So for those of us who are misinformed or uninformed, what who were these people? And because there were no witches, tell us a little bit about who were your ancestors, because you are a granddaughter. You can say that in a
right.
different way, I hope. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I am the descendant of a woman who was hanged for witchcraft. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up that phrase because I totally, I've always understood the impulse behind it as the sort of connective, honoring impulse toward these people. But like you said, it tends to elide or to overlook a really crucial part of it, which is that the vast majority of people who have ever been killed in witch hunts did not say that they were witches. They did not identify as witches. They did not think they were witches. Some of them, like my ancestor, who was a woman named Martha Carrier, who was killed in the Salem witch trials of 1692, were in fact executed because they refused to confess to witchcraft. So it adds in this really complicated layer where, this honoring impulse ends up sort of pulling on a different thread than we intend to. So my ancestor, Martha Carrier, she grew up in the town of Massachusetts in Andover. She was about 40 years old when the Salem witch trials happened. And she was, in many ways, she is a typical sort of the typical kind of person who would be accused of witchcraft in the American colonial period and has a lot of similarities with people who would be accused of witchcraft in the Great Witch Hunts of Europe, which are happening sort of over the previous 2 centuries before Salem. In that she is most women who were accused of witchcraft were middle-aged or old or elderly. She's on the young end. She's about 40 years old, but it's still, just over the amount, the age range. She has a husband. She is married, which is unusual. It's more likely for women who are widowed, especially, or unmarried to be accused of witchcraft, partially because they have less social power, and fewer people to protect them. But Martha was married. She had 5 children. And her children were, the youngest is 3, the oldest is 17 when the trials start. And she and her 4 oldest children would all be accused of witchcraft and arrested. And her 2 oldest children were actually tortured to get them to confess to witchcraft. The second of those boys, the 15-year-old boy, is my ancestor. And Martha maintained her innocence the entire time. She was sort of became known as this very dismissive, almost scathing, scornful presence in the courtroom. And she was telling the judges, these people are lying. This isn't true. I'm not a witch. You're getting fooled by the devil, in fact. Because also, as you pointed out, she was a Christian. She was a Puritan. She was absolutely, thought of herself as a woman of faith. And so she saw this as she saw her accusers as being influenced by the devil. She's understanding this, of course, in a Christian context. And then she, maintains her innocence. And after about 3 months in jail, she was taken to Gallows Hill and executed. All 4 of her children who were accused survived the trials. They were released after, but yeah, it sort of tears her family apart. One of her sisters is accused, some nieces and nephews. It's a whole Salem fundamentally is sort of a family affair.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is precisely that, right? In 2024, we can sometimes, at some places, we can openly say, yeah, I'm a witch. Or in my case, I'm indigenous and a witch, right? Because those two were things that will secure you, if you were in colonial America, as you said earlier, America, the continent, right. In colonial America, practicing our indigenous ways, it was seen as witchcraft. There are full books and accounts of, this Indians are worshiping the devil, and just because the colonizers, mostly Christians, didn't understand that we were talking about nature and metaphorically and etc. But these women, now we can say at some places, but not at all places. And then now people whom are not being persecuted, not being abused, not being anything but held accountable, are crying out that it's a witch hunt. And that adds insult to injury. And God knows how many of us have a claim to be descendants of those who were murdered. In your case, you have the facts, right? You have the evidence. But a lot of us don't have that concrete evidence, right? And then to hear somebody that is not being persecuted,
yeah,
and read between the lines, to say, oh, this is a witch hunt, etc. Tell me, how does that feel, Alice?
Oh my God. Well, I actually wrote an article about this for The Nation a couple years ago, where I was analyzing at that point Donald Trump's usage of the phrase witch hunt and how it had ratcheted up over the last few months. Because I have a Google alert set for witch hunts and for killings after someone is accused of witchcraft, which we can go into more, but is still an ongoing problem around the world today. And so my Google alert started going crazy, but not because more people were being attacked or tortured or killed after being accused of witchcraft, but because Trump and then all of these, people in positions of power who wanted to frame any legitimate criticism of them as fundamentally unfair. Because, what does it mean to call something a witch hunt? It means that we're saying this is a fundamentally flawed investigation. This cannot have happened. I am just being totally unfairly persecuted. I can't even have done the thing that you are accusing me of doing, which is like fundamentally not the case when you are investigating someone in a position of power who had the ability to do that thing.
And it's
And
very likely to have done, allegedly.
right. And very like the point is like doing an investigation of how power can be misused
Mhm,
by a person in power is not at all the same thing as the witch hunts of history and the witch hunts that are still happening today, which they're the single most sort of uniting factor is that they target people without social or economic power. They target people who are poor, they target people who are socially marginalized, they target people who fundamentally do not have the kind of power that would allow them to do what they're being accused of doing.
mhm,
And so this is why it's just a total, um, it's a ridiculous misuse of the term. A witch hunt as a metaphor can be a really powerful metaphor, but it has to actually, pull on what a witch hunt is, which is like you're accusing someone who couldn't have done the thing that you're accusing them
mhm.
of doing, as opposed to, a commander in chief who might have misused his political power.
Yeah. So in the colonial times of Mexico, with some remnants of the Inquisition that transfer from Spain, um, mostly women, but women and children and men were accused, right, of practicing witchcraft, worshiping the devil, etc., by worshiping nature and by having their own ways and our own practices that they did not understand. And the talk of like human sacrifice and all that, which is like, A, didn't happen, or if it happened, it was like once in a blue moon, someone you capture, it would
Right.
be food for the gods or whatever. Talking about sacrificing, how many sacrifices have happened in the name of other gods and other martyrdoms, but
Right.
if we start talking about that, we're never going to end up good show.
For sure.
But what was, for some of us who are, just scratching the tip of the iceberg, I have always known that the women at Salem were accused out of a political move, and that were mostly, married with the capital, like these women were widows, they have inherited, they have money, they have assets, and that was the reason, that was the main reason. However, the stories that we hear says it was little girls, it was young women accusing other women, which I have always thought, well, they were told to do the thing. How did it happen? Why did it happen? How did
Yeah,
it?
I mean, these are the two big questions. That's the whole thing. And before I go right into that, I also want to touch on what you were saying earlier in the question, which is totally true and is I think one of the when the sort of Spaniards bring the Inquisition to Central and South America and basically take the infrastructure
And Mexico and North
and
America.
Mexico, yeah.
Yeah.
And like take the infrastructure that they've created in the Inquisition in Spain in the 13 and 1400s, and that they're, is sort of being perfected across Europe to kill witches there. And then they bring it and use it both to as a tool of sort of imposing Christianity, and like you were saying, anyone who practices an indigenous religion or spirituality or is worshiping nature can be, that can then be used to persecute and to kill them. And it's also um, uh, there's some good reading on this that we can talk about if people are interested. But it's also used then to basically um, keep it. The thing about a witch hunt is that it can, because it can sort of be deployed against anyone at any time, it
Mhm.
can be used to keep a whole population in a state of fear and in a state of, it's a really powerful political tool to keep, of repression. And so because it's a very versatile tool, and like you don't have to, catch someone, breaking a law necessarily.
Yeah.
You can just watch them do their do like a spiritual practice and then decide that that's how you're going to kill them.
And in Mexico, which is, America, North America, South America, Central, as they divide it here in the United States, but for us it's like one continent.
Mhm.
And North America, the biggest witch hunts that were brought by the Spaniards, they started in Mexico. And it's such an effective way of repression that to this day, 2024, people are incredibly superstitious, my people, Mexicans, and incredibly fearful of witches.
Mm.
But what we call witches, or at least how I identify it, right, in Mexico, is like, yeah, I work with nature and the herbs and this and that. And the tactic that they use is because we were all knowledgeable of nature. So they really planted the fear of your neighbor. It's
Right.
it's a wonderful tool for domination, but please carry on.
Totally. No, totally. It's witch hunts are some of the most destructive destructive things that you can use on social solidarity. Because you can't a witch could be anywhere, and so if you're taught to fear them, you can't trust anybody. But before we get too sidetracked from Salem, you asked why
I know.
Salem happened. No, I know. I brought us back around. So why Salem happened? You know, to some extent, every witch hunt has to be understood in its political context. Like you're completely right. It's the political and economic context of the time, the religious context of the time, how women are treated. And in Salem specifically, Salem is kind of a perfect storm of factors where Puritanism as a religion, as a form of Christianity, is uniquely fertile ground for a witch hunt because it it taught them, they believed absolutely that the devil was real and was trying to uh, destroy them at any, given any sort of half a chance, and that the devil could recruit people on earth to like work for him and cause problems, and these were witches. And so they first, first of all, they have that basis of the ground to stand on. Then they have the witch trial, the Salem witch trials start, the accusations start in a place called Salem Village, which is not actually modern day Salem of today. It's now called Danvers, Massachusetts, nearby to Salem. And Salem Village in 1692 is known as like, they're having a terrible time. They're known for their infighting. They have been having all of these internal battles over whether or not to become an independent town, whether or not to they're having battles again around church doctrine, and sort of how conservative they want their church to be, who should be allowed to be baptized, who should be allowed to do what in the community, basically. And there are a lot of people, like anywhere in Massachusetts. I'm not saying this was totally unique, but we know a lot about them in Salem because of what happened next. There are a lot of people with property disputes and inheritance disputes and all the kind of disputes that you get when you live in an agrarian society in close proximity with people. And, you're going to have fights. And when the Salem witch trials begin, when the accusations begin, we see a lot of those old disputes resurfacing. We see people, if you've had a land dispute with this person, there's a chance that you might end up accusing them of witchcraft. And it's not, from our sort of 2024 perspective, it's easy to look back on that and be like, oh, well, it was just revenge. It was just greed. And for some people, it may have been. And for others, it may have been a really genuine, if you think that if you believe that your neighbor could be a witch who has been trying to harm you, that becomes a retroactive justification for why you were having a land dispute in the first place. Because, who would want to cause me problems? It's probably my neighbor. Okay, if they're a witch, that's why they were doing this. And then you have this vicious circle of justification. But so you have all of these sort of schisms and existing rifts within the community rear up. And the reason that they rear up is there's a good way to think about witch hunts that is called the wildfire model, where basically, like a wildfire, you need the ground to be set. So that's what we've been talking about with, with Puritanism, with these sort of internal rifts. There's a lot, the economic system of Salem is changing right before the trials begin. People who thought they were going to be wealthy are getting poorer. People who started poor are getting wealthier, and that's throwing everybody off. Mercantile capitalism, sort of early capitalism, is taking hold, and there's this transition from a much more agrarian survival-based economy, frontier economy, to a we are shipping, we are trading, money is moved around in a different way, and the market forces are really destabilizing things. Plus, there was just a coup in England. The King of England gets overthrown 3 years before the trial starts. And in Massachusetts, they get rid of their governor. And so there's like very little political stability in Massachusetts as well. So all of these things come together. We have this very well-primed ground for a destabilizing moment. And then we have a spark. And perhaps the most common spark in witch hunts is some kind of unexplained illness or unexplained death. It's not always that, but that's a very common one. And that's what happens in Salem, is that these two young girls, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, the daughter and the niece of the village minister, start having these fits that are inexplicable, and they're convulsing and, lying comatose and refusing to do their chores and talking back to their elders and various things that their parents, the minister, the father and uncle are like, he's sort of like, what could this be? But because he's been having all these disputes with his parishioners, he becomes convinced that there are witches in the community that are trying to screw with his life, basically. And they've been trying to screw with his life in terms of his church, and now look, his home is being afflicted demonic well. And so you have this moment where the girls are the ones who start the accusations, but teenage girls, the main afflictors in Salem become this group of teenage girls between the ages really like 11 and 19. And they are eventually joined by some adult women and even some men, but they're sort of the core of it. And they do an incredible amount of accusing. Like, I'm not underplaying their role, but they have no political power on their own. A teenage girl in Puritan Massachusetts cannot make an accusation against an adult man and have that accusation stick unless she has backing from someone more powerful, who in this case is her parents and the minister and the sort of the system that comes behind them. And what, like you were saying, you think the girls were basically told, there's the possibility the girls were told what to do. That's very possible. Some girls definitely accused people who their families had long-standing disputes with. Others, the sort of 17, 18-year-olds were definitely acting, and were definitely like, they were coordinating in the courtroom. And if a woman who had been accused, like my ancestor, said, I'm not a witch, and then she turns to look at them and they would all scream and fall down as soon as she looked, in order to sort of, or if they would coordinate, like, oh, she talks about a bird flying, and then they're gonna freak out like there's a bird flying over their heads. And so it's a very coordinated effort. But I also do want to point out that there's both for the accusers in Salem and for confessors in Salem, many of them may have believed it. It's in fact very likely that many of them believed it, because they were existing within a culture that took this incredibly seriously. And we can't, like, it does a disservice both to them and to the story to just sort of think it was all trickery. Like they really thought this was a possibility, and were acting they thought accordingly.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I'm listening to you talking about this historic moment that feels so far away, right? 300 years. And then when you mention a teenage girl accusing an elder person of power doesn't have a lot of weight, and I'm like, yeah, we haven't changed that much.
Yeah.
you know. And as a feminist and a witch, of course, we have so much to chew on. But part of a very important part of the book that you wrote is to reclaim and to connect with your ancestor, but also to bring attention to it has an end, and we don't see it ending anytime soon.
Yeah.
There was a huge, because social media actually picked up on it in like 2017, 2018 in Africa.
Yeah.
And then they started talking about kill the witches. And of course, we were fearful because we, like I said at the beginning, sometimes some places can say openly the freedom is nothing but a smoke. Um, Tell us about the witch hunts of today. And I truly believe your book to be so timed so perfectly. I don't know if you could see it, but now they're calling our Democratic runner a witch.
Yeah.
Other names, but just for being a woman. So I know there's so much to chew on. So pick one and run with it.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it's the topic that keeps on giving. I'll start with witch hunts happening today, because this is, I think, probably the least known part of, when people talk about Salem, when people talk about witch hunts in the United States, they tend to talk about them as if they are the province of the past, as if they are exclusively this thing that is, ancient, that Salem happened 300 years ago. It's interesting, but like, why are we still talking about this? And we don't have perfect numbers because the data is really lacking and a lot of cases go unreported. But the best guess is that somewhere between uh, like 1,000 and 2,000 people are killed, tortured, exiled, otherwise harmed after being accused of witchcraft worldwide every year. That is a rate that just far outpaces Salem, far outpaces the Great Witch Hunts of Europe. And, most of these, the majority of, so first of all, these cases have happened in over 50 countries in the last decade. They happen all over the world. Um, the majority happen in countries that were colonized and are recovering from colonialism. And as we touched on earlier, a lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it has to do with the imposition of Christianity onto countries that were colonized by Christian European nations, and certain ways in which Catholicism and Christianity sort of reacted and integrated with indigenous religions, and then sort of continued to either persecute or sort of rebound, and create, as you were talking about, sort of like a still enduring fear of witches. And a lot of it also has to do with like the economic troubles that colonial that nations face as they decolonize, and the fact of there was a anthropologist historian in Kenya who did some work looking at in the 1990s in Kenya as uh, the Kenyan government finally, in order to, they got loans from the IMF and the World Bank in order to stabilize the economy. And part of the conditions of those loans were to cut social services, to cut, you have to cut the fat on education, on healthcare, on social safety nets, which has been termed by some academics as sort of a neo version of colonialism that happened in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And as his work showed that as those social safety nets get cut, and as people are living in a world that is more economically uncertain, witch hunts increase, which like makes total sense. When people are experiencing hardship, and and there's no recourse. Recourse gets in other ways, and so the sort of the macroeconomic forces also really help to shape this. But what it leads to is, we witch hunting is a many-headed hydra, and like there's not one way to fix it or to just sort of make it go away. People who I know who are working on organizing against witch hunts where they live and around the world focus often on a mix of education. So you're just like talking to people about how to sort of how to intervene, how to sort of try to keep a witchcraft accusation from escalating into physical violence. And so it's sort of a mix of education, policy advocacy. Some people go sort of a route toward the criminal legal system and try to get people, people who then perpetrate witch hunts to then have them enter the legal system. But it's really hard. There's not sort of a one size answer.
It's definitely some horrible thing that happens, and the fact that is mostly geared towards women and girls, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that people of other genders are not excluded.
Totally. And it depends where you are as well. The cultural context, there's some places where mostly it still is focused on women, although there's a rising number of children being the main victims. But in various places, men are also, especially elderly men, are victims.
And the albino community.
Yes, absolutely.
And the albino community. It's horrible. Tell us about Martha. Tell us about the book. Tell us about your encounter with her.
Yeah.
How does she reach out to you?
Yeah. So Martha, my ancestor. So I found out about her when I was 13 years old. And then I had this experience the following year, which I talk about first thing in the book. So it's not really a spoiler. It's on like page 3, where I was visiting my brother at college, and I was walking through a library and sort of wandered off by myself. And I went over to a bookshelf, and I don't know why I went to this bookshelf or pulled out this book, but it was a book on Salem, and I opened it, and there was her name in the book. And it sort of jump-started this interest for me where I wanted to know not just, I wanted to know why she had died, who had killed her, what had led to her death. And I wanted to know who she had been as a person when she was alive. Because the fundamental thing about everyone who has ever been killed in a witch hunt is that they were a person first, right? Like before they get assigned the moniker of witch as this sort of tool of otherization and of demonization, they were a person. And so I wanted to know who she had been when she was a person. And I found out to some extent because the Puritans actually kept, pretty good records. And she, by all accounts, was a very strong-willed, tempestuous, kind of a bitch, like very forceful woman, and which was, not in line with Puritan expectations of womanhood and femininity in the 1680s and 90s. She got married. She was 7 months pregnant when she got married. So she got pregnant out of wedlock, another big Puritan no-no. And the accounts from the time, show her as opposed to her husband being the one who's arguing with neighbors and about like the boundaries of the farm, and she's yelling at people and sort of being this a very loud and formidable presence. And she definitely reminds me of some people in my family. And I found myself being, I like have a real affection for her, which is also I've always found sort of interesting because to some extent I don't know her, right? Like I know as much of her as I can unearth, but to some extent this idea of her that I have in my head is also, of course, a creation or an intuition? You know, it's how do you parse that? How do you sort of decide what comes to you from where? But I
You're
really
asking a witch, so I don't
so
know. I don't know if you want the answer, but yeah.
I mean, you know, I think I I would love your answer. I would love to know. And I think that one of my big so this book, it's a dual narrative, right? Where half I have two threads of narrative. One tells Martha's story. And I wrote it basically as historical fiction so that I could be sort of as close to her as possible. And then the other narrative thread is from my point of view as I was researching her and trying to put her life back together and then doing my research into witch hunts happening today. And it goes back and forth chapter to chapter. And I found a big sort of thing that I was chasing in writing the book was the feeling that I was finding her voice, sort of what she was able to leave behind. Because we do have some transcripts of the preliminary hearing for trial for witchcraft, for example, where she speaks and we have her voice, and then we have totally blank spaces in the record where there should be information, but there isn't. And so I felt like a lot of this was I was chasing her voice, and I was sort of chasing to, you know, to make this as true a representation of her as I could. And I'll never know totally if I'm right. But that's the complication.
Well, as a witch, as a person who very strongly believes, I'm Mexican. I cannot not believe on spirits and the dead. You know, it's
Yeah.
ingrained on our culture, and quite literally, I believe on our DNA. And what is now the Day of the Dead celebration, as we know it, right, infused now with Catholicism, originates from this goddess that, this entity, deity that is not necessarily a goddess, but a force of nature, um, who watches over the bones of the ancestors and watches over the souls of those who have um, ceased to exist physically on a body. But I always have found very fascinated that the fixation of these entities with the bones.
Mhm.
And science has proven by now, because they're catching up all the time, that it is there where our DNA hides and is passed down, right? It's from the bones, it's from the bone marrow, it's from, you know. So I truly believe that our ancestors are within us, in our bones. So maybe Martha is speaking from inside of you and not from the outside.
Mm.
And then if you think about it in a spiritual, in a most like mystical way, we are the creation of them. We are
Yeah.
what has survived. They become our pantheon of gods and goddesses, our ancestors, known and unknown, who will be watching over us, because I'm sure that the blessings that Martha set upon her children, especially the one that is your ancestor, those blessings carry. They say in Mexico that your grandmother's blessings will never die.
Mm.
So I truly believe, Alice, reading the book and now speaking with you, I truly believe that, in a very witchy way, that you connected with her because she was calling on you from inside,
Mm.
not from outside. But again, you're asking a witch. So
No, I
go ahead.
thank you for saying that. I love that. And I I feel you're probably right.
I think so. Of course, I said it, so I think I'm right. What what is our future, you think, us, the way we see the political environment here in the United States, um, the extremes are getting extremier,
Right.
and where we claimed a few decades back that there was freedom of religion and freedom to exist and pursue happiness and all of those things that I didn't grow up with because I'm Mexican from Mexico, but I came here and have
Right.
lived through for 26 years. Um, for us who are pagan, neo-pagan, Wiccan, witches, spiritual folk, New Age folk, whatever, what are some signs you think that we have to be very alert on,
Mm.
make sure that we are safe? It is,
Yeah.
isn't it incredible that it's actually a thing?
Right. It does feel kind of crazy that it's like that's a real thing we have to talk about. But I don't think that you're wrong to ask. I think that um the there's a real movement in this country right now to frankly to return to a kind of Puritanism, to sort of a neo-Puritanism. There is a real Christian nationalist movement, and a white Christian nationalist movement specifically that wants to that believes that the US should be an explicitly Christian country and should not have the freedom of religion and should not have people should not be allowed to live in ways that they want to if it's in conflict with that. I'm thinking about Project 2025 and this plan that was exposed by this right-wing think tank, thinking about how to sort of, if a Republican is elected to the presidency, to change some of the infrastructure and people who are in charge of the Department of Education and the various sort of lower posts to make real shifts in the way that uh, Americans live, with the purpose of uh, creating a kind of cultural hegemony and power that is aligned with this the Christian nationalist project to an extent. Right. And a lot of the authors of that plan have been exposed that they have connections to this like white nationalist and Christian nationalist project. And so I think that is the thing to be really aware of. Because I've read through some of the Christian nationalist like um plans, and it's just like what the Puritans wanted to do. It's this idea that, biblical, sort of the injunction of biblical law, implication of biblical law, where it's that is how the only way people should live. That should be the only law. You should have no civic law, only religious law, and it should just be like directly based uh, on Christianity. And it's like that is not personally not a country that I would like to live in. And I think that that's the case for many people. And I think we're going to see, we're certainly seeing increased Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and I would imagine that we're seeing, yeah, as well. I think it's probably less studied and less like data qualified, which means it can sort of fly under the radar more, but certainly doesn't mean it's not happening. Of you know, otherization and rejection and demonization of people who practice witchcraft and Wiccanism and sort of and spiritualities. So
And migration, as if this country was not created by migrants.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that we definitely I would keep an eye out on, the rising Christian fascist tendencies.
Yeah. And what I have to say to our listeners, honestly, is scare yet? Revoked. Revoked.
Yeah.
Because a lot of our livelihoods, lifestyles, and just by existing, we are being threatened by
Yeah.
this new radicalization of neo-Puritanism, you call it?
I would call it that. Yeah. I would say that the
Very
authors of
good.
2025 really are aiming us toward a neo-Puritanism, where they would where there will be, would be like biblical magistrates of the kind that they had in Salem. That is, I'm not making that up. I read that in
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Time flies when you're having fun. Can you believe that we've been at it for about 45 minutes already? When we said, oh, we gotta keep it short and sweet. No, there's no way. You put two powerful women together and time just flies. The book is The Once and Future Witch Hunt, A Descendant's Reckoning from Salem to the Present by Alice Markham-Cantor, foreword by Rebecca Tracer, and afterword by Sylvia Federici. What a wonderful book.
Thank you.
I tell you folks, once you open it, you cannot put it down. And before we say goodbye today, Alice, I have to ask you, the usual questions. Where can people get your book?
You should, you can get it from wherever, major booksellers. You can get it at IndieBound if you want to get it, like order it from your local bookstore. You can order it on Amazon. And although I hate to recommend Jeff Bezos, but and you can you can request it from your local library.
Absolutely. And obviously you can get it from Lil, and thank you for them to send me this wonderful book. And after today, September 9, because today is September 9, do you have any other presentations? Are you doing any other podcasts? Are you doing signing books? What's happening?
Yeah, I have I'll be doing some more podcasts this fall, September. I'm going up to nearby to Salem actually for a couple events this fall. So when we're a little closer, I'll be able to give out the details of those. But you can find me at Alice Markham-Cantor author on Instagram or alicemarkhamcantor.com. And I will be posting all the information there.
You heard her here, folks. Thank you so much, Alice, for being here. I feel that we needed like another 5 hours to continue just chatting. But time is of the essence. And just to remind everybody very, very quickly, we are on CSN Podcast, the Circle Century Network Podcast, and yours truly, producer of Lunatic Mondays. For September 23rd, we're going to have Courtney Weaver talking about her book, Sacred Tears. October 14th, you cannot miss it. It's going to be the Tarot Divas night. Sasha Graham, Chanda, and Sarah Beck, and yours truly talking all about tarot and divination because it's the season of the witch. And then on October 28th, Nathan King is going to be our guest. And also, of course, all of the other shows. We have Circle Talk with Deborah Rose. We have Circle of Nature with Selena Fox. We have Blue Marble with Charlotte Bear. We have Songs of the Pagan Tribe with Karen Greenman. And we have Paganos del Mundo, or Bilingual Show, with Christian Ortiz, Carolina Moore, Monica Bobin, Harwood Tuileva, and Patricia Finclair every Saturday on Spanish and English. And of course, Lunatic Mondays, twice a month, on the second and fourth Monday of the month. My name is Laura González, and to you, Alice, I just have to say thank you so much for being here. I'll leave you the microphone so you can say goodnight to your audience.
Thank you so much, Laura. This was great. I had such a wonderful time. And thank you to you all for listening and reading.
And to everyone who are listening now or later, don't forget to write a review for your author. Buy the book and just tell them, I bought the book. It's fantastic. That's all you have to do. Don't do like Laura that writes essays. And until we meet again, never forget that you are loved. Good night.